Hello everyone, I'm Frank the GaminTank, and this is something different. Since I've been reviewing games, I would pick whatever games and have little to no reasoning behind those choices. Now I figured that I can change that with my first trilogy of reviews, and it's gonna all be on The Legend of Zelda. I was introduced to the series with the NES original at a young age and would eventually play games like A Link to the Past, and then move on to the 3D games like Ocarina of Time via the Collector's Edition on GameCube. I figure why not a trilogy of reviews with a series that I love? This trilogy is going to include The Legend of Zelda, Zelda 2 The Adventure of Link, and The Legend of Zelda A Link to the Past. The Legend of Zelda was released on the Famicom in 1986 and on the NES in 1987, and it's considered one of the best games on the system. If there's a top 10 NES games list, there's a good chance that this game is on that list. Zelda 1 is also considered one of the most influential games, laying the groundwork for open world action RPGs. On top of that, this game is the first to use an internal battery to save the player's progress, instead of using a password system like other games released at the time. The battery backup would be the standard for all cartridge-based games that save on the card itself until the release of the Nintendo DS, and the shift away from cartridges on home consoles. And with all of that covered, let's begin. The story goes as follows. Many years ago, Ganon stole the Triforce of Power. Princess Zelda takes her Triforce of Wisdom, breaks it into 8 pieces, and scatters them across the land of Hyrule to prevent Ganon from having both. Before her capture, Zelda instructed Impa to find a man with enough courage to destroy Ganon. On her search for this man, she found herself surrounded by Ganon's henchmen. Suddenly, a young man appeared and drove off Ganon's henchmen, saving Impa from a terrible fate. The young man named Link heard of Impa's plea for help. She tells our hero that he must collect the 8 pieces of the Triforce and fight Ganon to save the princess. And now, our adventure begins. The Legend of Zelda is an action-adventure game from a bird's-eye view. You play as Link as he goes from dungeon to dungeon, fighting monsters and finding items, all to collect the 8 pieces of the Triforce of Wisdom and save Princess Zelda. Link can only move in 4 directions, and whenever he reaches the end of the screen, the game will stop and scroll to the next part. Pressing the A button will let Link use his sword to stab enemies. At full health, he can shoot beams out of his sword, but will go away if he takes damage. You can only shoot one at a time, so any attempts to use another just has you stabbing at the air until the already shot beam disappears. With the right spacing, you can land one hit with the sword and then one with the beam to do more damage. There are 2 obtainable upgrades later that will drastically increase the amount of damage you can do to enemies. Pressing the B button will allow you to use whatever item is selected. These can be anything from bow and arrows, bombs, boomerangs, etc. Most of the items can be used for combat, others can be used for exploration. Bombs can either be obtained by enemies dropping them, or by buying them with rupees at one of the many shops scattered around Hyrule. Arrows can only be used by obtaining a bow, and each arrow will use up 1 rupee. Boomerangs can cause your enemies to freeze, and can kill the weakest of enemies. The boomerang can also be thrown in 8 directions, allowing it to hit enemies that are out of range. Link has 3 hearts at the start of the game, and losing all the hearts will result in game over. If you're in the overworld, it starts you at the beginning point of the game. Dying in a dungeon, fortunately, starts you at the beginning of that dungeon. For defense, you can use your shield to deflect rocks, and the upgraded shield can be used to deflect rocks and fireballs. There also exists 2 defense upgrades, the blue and red rings. They decrease the amount of damage Link takes from enemies. Heart containers can be found all around Hyrule and at the end of each dungeon. Getting them increases your health by 1 entire heart. Enemies also drop hearts that refill your life by 1 heart. Some shops sell 2 types of potions. Blue potions that can revive your health to full, and so does the red potion. The only difference is that the blue potion is a 1-time use, and the red potion is 2-time uses. Fairies will also recover your health if you do not have the rupees to buy potions, or if you're nearby. Link can find many items to help explore the land around him. I mentioned earlier that the bombs can be used to dispose of enemies, but they can also be used to blow up holes in a wall, to open up shops, secrets, and in dungeons, they can create shortcuts to access secret entrances to other rooms. The stepladder allows Link to walk over water to nearby ground if the block of water is only 1 square of space, horizontal or vertical. This can make it easier to navigate some of the dungeons and allow easier access to certain areas in Hyrule. The Raft is another item that can help carry Link to an isolated island, which become required at some point in the game. The recorder can warp you to a dungeon at random, or so I thought. If you face north or west, you will be warped to the next dungeon. Facing south or east will warp you to the previous dungeon. At some point, you may accidentally run into the power bracelet. Once you do, you may be able to push one of 4 pushable rocks in the world that resemble some of the rooms in the dungeons. They will lead you to a room where you can warp to other points with pushable rocks. Just be sure to keep track of what goes where. The game controls pretty well. Stabbing enemies to their death is so satisfying, and there's a great amount of thought put into the various weapons you can acquire. Well, most of them. Like I said, the control is solid, but I have noticed some oddities with them. Every now and then when Link makes a 90-degree turn, there's a chance that he takes a slight step forward when he turns. It's not a big deal, but only a minor nuisance since you really need to be aware of your positioning, especially when it comes to battling enemies. Speaking of fighting enemies, they start off relatively weak, and easy to dispose of. Well, the bosses have to be easy, right? Not really, and this is a strength of the game. Not the fact that the bosses are easy, but the fact that you don't have to brute force your way through the entire game. If you fight smart, the bosses will crumble, like using bombs on Dodongos, which I believe is mandatory, or an arrow on a Goma. Even normal enemies like Lanamola can be killed faster if you use a bomb, rather than trying to just stab it. In the Japanese version, the Pole's voice can be destroyed by making noise into the microphone of the second controller, but for international players, use the arrows. But before I continue, I need to back up a bit. After Dungeon 2 or 3, you start to realize something with the dungeon enemies. Link is weak. Although playing smart will get you far, Link's defense becomes your biggest obstacle. Starting with his green tunic, Link will be easily overpowered when he runs into rooms filled with dark nuts. This is where the blue ring and the white sword come in. You'll have a stronger attack and can take more abuse, since the ring lowers the amount of damage you take. I think this is really neat. It gets you to explore the overworld for the solution you need. It's not that easy, as the areas where you can receive the sword upgrades tend to have Lionels nearby, and they do a lot of damage. On top of that, the difficulty scales once again when you run into Riz Robes later in the game. Like the Dark Nuts, they are always in a group. Unlike the Dark Nuts, they have moments of invincibility when they teleport. On top of that, they hit really hard, and there's no armor upgrade until the very last dungeon in the game, so items like potions are a must. It seems like the dungeons become a test of endurance, making them go from 10-minute runs to nearly taking an hour. That wouldn't be an issue early on, but it really makes the game drag as you later discover that all the dungeons are not in plain sight. Some dungeons, including dungeons 4, 5, 7, and 8. Now, I'm going to go one by one and decide whether or not these are acceptable. Dungeon 4 can only be accessed by the use of a raft in one of two areas that it can be used. Now, this isn't that bad since there aren't many places in this and you obtain it in the previous dungeon. Plus, if you get to the other one, you get a free heart container. This one gets a pass. Dungeon 5 requires you to go to what is known as the Lost Hills. To access this dungeon, you must walk north 4 screens. Not only is this a bit cryptic, but unnecessary. You only go in one direction to solve it. At least the Lost Woods has an actual cryptic path. Yes, you can find out how to progress through the dungeon because of the person in the waterfall, but that doesn't help much because there's a screen above it that gives you the white sword, and I've always thought that's what that person meant. So the path of the dungeon is completely pointless. The hint isn't. Dungeon 7 has to be the worst ideas for a hidden entrance. To get to it, you need to first go to the only fairy fountain without a fairy, and then use the recorder to dry up the fountain and reveal the entrance. But wait, you can find a hint in the previous dungeon by using the doorway in plain sight or bomb open the alternate entrance. While that is true, the room is tucked in pretty far into the dungeon itself. Since this is an area with many whiz robes, it's easier said than done. There's also the chance of completely missing this room, which I'll get into later. And at last, Dungeon 8. To find this one, you must burn a bush at a dead end in the woods. I'd call this cryptic, but there are two counter-arguments to this claim. One, to find the hint, you basically have to do the same method as obtaining the power bracelet and the blue ring. And two, it's in a very weird spot for a dead end. If anything, this makes it more suspicious since you'll be burning things to get rupees, lose rupees, and access some shops. Finding one of these will inevitably happen, so I give this a pass. Remember when I mentioned using bombs to create alternate entrances to some rooms and dungeons, and to access hidden areas in the overworld? This becomes a huge problem because if you're going in for all the heart containers, you'll be constantly running out of bombs because this game limits you to a maximum of 8 bombs at the start. Don't forget that bombs are required for defeating Dodongos, which show up more often later in the game, and you'll need at least one to enter the final dungeon. In Dungeons 5 and 7, you can buy upgrades to increase your maximum by 4 each. And if you're trying to scavenge bombs, it becomes a problem because it seems as though the bombs drop randomly. Or not. There's a way to determine how they drop, but that requires outside help. In fact, newer players might need some sort of strategy guide just to find certain items that are throughout the overworld, and I, along with those newer players, might consider this Zelda 1's greatest weakness. Navigation after the second or third dungeon becomes a nightmare, and that thing in the corner this game calls a map is wasted space. It's too easy to miss things without a guide. In the run I did for this video, I used a map as I played through this game, but I used nothing for the dungeons when I entered them for the first time. There have been 2 or 3 occasions where I would finish the level, but miss an item and have to return. Or, I would finish the game without the red ring. It wouldn't be an issue if some of the items were not required to make progress. I will say that the map in the inventory screen and the map in the corner of the action screen make a great navigation tool in dungeons when they're used together. When it comes to visual presentation, it's pretty simple. Now, I'm not really going to knock it because it was released pretty early in the NES's life. It's not bad or ugly, it's just simple. The colors are nice in the overworld, and nothing really blends in a negative way. My only complaint is that the inside of the dungeons are all one color, so some dungeons will be all blue, or all green, or all gray, especially for the final dungeon. The screen scrolling is smooth and doesn't have any tearing, which is nice. One thing that looks a little odd to me is the fact that trees have a shadow, but I don't see shadows on anything else. It's not a complaint, just an observation. I really think the music is good. Of course, there's a memorable overworld theme that plays through many games in the series. The dungeon theme was the only one heard here, and that awful Zelda cartoon. They're all okay, maybe except for the final dungeon theme. I'm sure somebody likes it, but not me. Even though I say the music is good, you only hear the overworld and dungeon theme through the whole game. And they're pretty short, so by the end of the game, they come off as a bit annoying. This is more towards the dungeon theme. I got sick of it 4 to 5 dungeons in the game because of the length of the dungeon runs. If anything, the sound effects are really spot on. Every attack has an appropriate effect and adds an extra bit of punch. Makes you really feel like you're poking things. One final thing before I wrap up this review. There is a second quest that is accessed by passing the game and selecting that file afterwards, or you can start a fresh save and input the player's name as Zelda. Just be prepared for the increased difficulty and the altered positions of items and dungeons, as this is made for players who have mastered the original quest. The Legend of Zelda is a game that started a series that I love, but it didn't age well. And I hate to say that, but I can't lie about these things. Some items in the dungeons are hidden a little too well and the damage output shoots up rather than gradually increasing. Part is due to the strength of the enemies, and part is due to Link's sword attacks being limited to just stabbing. Recommending this game is tough without recommending a use of some sort of walkthrough. To the purists out there, yes, I understand you can beat this game without a walkthrough because you memorized everything or drew a map, but that doesn't mean this issue can't be ignored. If you aren't in the minority, then be prepared to get lost or to have your butt handed to you when you play. And that's it for Zelda 1. Let me know what you think about the game. Is it a masterpiece or is it a very flawed game? Or maybe your opinions are in the middle. Let me know down in the comments below. Up next is The Legend of Zelda 2: The Adventure of Link. Until then, I'm Frank the GaminTank, and I hope you enjoyed the review, and as always, thanks for watching.